The reading this morning will be taken from the Old Testament, from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, verses 4 through 14. Jeremiah 29, 4 through 14. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile.
Have you ever thought about what the Apostle Peter must have felt like as he traveled around with the other apostles, with Jesus, as he became a fairly important figure in the early church, as he remembered his roots as a Galilean fisherman who was relatively uneducated, and where, interestingly, in Jerusalem, people recognized somehow by looking at him and maybe smelling him that he was a fisherman. How out of place he must have felt. The reason I raised that is because it's Peter, especially in his first letter, 1 Peter, who speaks about Christians being aliens and strangers, exiles in the world. It's like recognizing that there are some people who will feel like, and others will feel like, just don't seem to belong, just not part of that culture or that setting. Somebody who's really different. And you think about an exile, somebody who's been taken from their home and put in another land, another place. Alien, somebody, again, who is different and doesn't belong. Stranger. You know, those images are really quite significant. This picture is of what's called the Ishtar Gate. It was one of the gates of the city of Babylon. And we want to think this morning about a time from the history of ancient Israel, of the Jews, that they were exiles. And just kind of, again, as we like to do, the background, you know, it's that period of time that we know of as the Babylonian captivity. It's late in the period of Old Testament history, that after the kingdom of Israel had divided in half between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, in about 720, 721, the northern kingdom of Israel fell, never to be reestablished. And the southern kingdom of Judah continued on. But Judah kept running into difficulties until God finally allowed the Babylonians to come and conquer. And so Jerusalem and Judah have fallen. to the Babylonians. And the result of that is that what the Babylonians did was kind of an interesting policy, is they would take some of the people, and in this case what's mentioned is the princes, the officials, the craftsmen, the artisans, and others that were taken from Jerusalem and Judah and moved to Babylon. And so this chapter that we've just read part of is a letter from the prophet Jeremiah, who is speaking for God. If you notice that he is affirming that this is God's message, and it is addressed in the first few verses of the chapter that we didn't read to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the others whom Nebuchadnezzar carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So it's addressed to those people who've been, we use words like transplanted, only it's not that nice, is it? They have been forcibly removed from their homes and taken somewhere else. A few chapters before, Jeremiah has had a very interesting message of prophecy. And it's about a vision of 2 baskets of figs that he has seen. And one basket is really good figs, and one is poor. The good figs are described like those that ripen early, and you can imagine and I don't know if maybe you don't eat figs, but I enjoy eating a fig every now and then. Can't say I run into the store to buy them, but if I'm somewhere and they're being served, it's really quite nice to eat a fig that's juicy, sweet, and great. And that's really what he's describing here. But there are other figs in another basket, and it says that they are poor. You don't want to eat them. They're inedible. And you think of, okay, they would be kind of woody and hard to chew and not very nice to eat. And so these 2 baskets of figs that Jeremiah is talking about represent the people of Jerusalem. And as there is the one basket of good, those are the ones that are going to be taken into exile. And the bad ones are the survivors that will remain in Jerusalem. Some of them will head down into Egypt. Some of them will intermarry with the nations that the Babylonians that will move into the land, and they will become the Samaritans. But as Jeremiah is given this prophecy, he is, you see, okay, the good figs are going to be there in Babylon, the choice ones, the leaders, the artisans, the craftsmen, the healthy young men. You think about the story in Daniel, and there's Daniel with the story of, we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're part of a group of very, very talented young men that have been transported and taken into exile. So God promises here in chapter 24, my eyes will watch over them, that is the good figs, the people in exile. My eyes will watch over them for their good, and I will bring them back to the land. So there's a promise here that God is making to those who will be exiled. And that kind of sets the scene for this letter that Jeremiah is writing to the exiles. And we don't have time to spend a lot, to talk a lot about the exiles and all that, but I think there's some things that we might, that, for example, one of the things that Jeremiah tells them is that the exile is going to last 70 years. And you might start thinking about, all right, somebody tells you that something's going to happen for you and your family that's really good, something you would really want to have happen, but it's not going to happen for 70 years. And you might be thinking, wow, that's not exactly going to be in my lifetime, is it? But it's going to come. And so the question kind of that needs to be answered is, what should the exiles do in this 70-year period? Do they just do nothing, sit and twiddle their thumbs? And just kill time for all of that? I don't know about you, but that's a long time to sit and twiddle your thumbs. Do they sit with their bags packed, ready to go? Like, you remember back in the Exodus, that before that last night and the night of the Passover, they're told to be dressed and ready to go so that in the morning they would be able to head out. Well, that's in the morning. That's not 70 years later. It's always interesting to think about how we react to time and waiting. How much longer do I have to wait? Next day, how much longer? How much longer? What do you do with that time? Do they resist and make the Babylonians' lives miserable? You think about that potential, and I'm sure there must have been some among the Jewish people who thought, well, that would be one way for us to really spend time is by killing Babylonians. But stirring up trouble and the consequences of that are not really a solution to the problem. And so Jeremiah writes to tell them about what they need to do for this 70-year period while they're waiting. And the first thing he tells them is that you need to go about normal life. And it's interesting that he spells it out very, very specifically, doesn't it? Build houses and settle down. I mean, how long does it take to build a house? That's going to be a time investment, right? Settle down. You're going to be here for a while, so you may as well get comfortable and do what you can. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. That again gives you a sense that at least, that's going to get you through 1 year, right? A 1 year cycle. You plant, then you wait, you harvest, and then you eat what you harvest, okay? And you do that 70 times and you're through. Now, that's a pretty slow process, isn't it? But it kind of gives you a sense. Marry and have children. Well, there's better part of a year, right? But then notice, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. Well, now you think about it, you've taken a good chunk of that 70 years up, haven't you? And so they may have children. So right here, the normal life is, building houses, planting gardens, having families, having children, having grandchildren. Get comfortable. This is not going to happen tomorrow. And increase in number. And it specifically says don't decrease. So, good starting point. That an exile living in this situation needs to be reasonably settled and comfortable for the time that it's going to take. But then secondly is the relationship that the exiles have with Babylon. I'm always somewhat amused to think about, and it's not a really funny thing in some ways, but to think about what the average Jew would have done in the New Testament time with Roman occupation. It wasn't an exile, but it might just as well have been, because the Roman armies were there dominating and enforcing their culture and their laws on the Jewish people. And I've often wondered about when a Roman officer compelled a Jewish man to carry his things for a mile, how that would have gone. Because somehow I suspect that it would have been a lot of muttering and murmuring under his breath as he carried the load. I kind of think about, and those of you who watch sports like baseball, you'll understand this. You see a player on the field standing in front of the umpire, facing away from the umpire and talking away very animatedly. And you know that the player is saying very unpleasant things to the umpire, but it kind of seems the rule is you don't embarrass the umpire in front of everybody else. So as long as you're not talking directly to him, like if you turn around and face him, like the catcher, that it's going to be, you pretty well seem to be able to say what you want to and however you want to say it. And I think that would have been a way that would have been very easy for the people in exile in Babylon to have treated their captors. I don't want to be here, and I'm going to make sure that you know it and that you say, well, no, that's not what Jeremiah tells them. He says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. That's God speaking through Jeremiah. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Now, I want you to notice the last part of that first. I want you to understand that you're here not just because the Babylonians conquered you and dragged you into captivity. I want you to understand that you're here because God caused it. That as a nation, the people of Judah and Jerusalem have so abandoned what they were supposed to have with God and how they were supposed to honor Him, that He has allowed them, actually sent them into captivity in a foreign land. So, number one, understand that you're here by the will of God. But while you're here, I want you to be working for good here. I want you to be seeking to build in the community, not just build your house, not just be selfish, but somehow to be serving the community that you're in and work for its welfare and its well-being. And you know what's interesting is you look at some of the stories that we have from the captivity, and I'm thinking especially as, some of the stories about people who rise into positions of leadership like Daniel. That you see that they are respected where they are. And he says, you will prosper as Babylon does. In other words, that by looking for the peace and prosperity of where you are, you will benefit from that. So pray for it. You may be in exile, you may be in a hostile place, but you need to be praying positively for the people and the rulers of the land and its welfare. You need patience, not losing it as you go. So being a positive influence in the land. But then there's another problem that comes up, kind of the third point about this. And that's really an interesting one. Don't listen to the false prophets. Now, what's interesting is the whole religious culture of Babylon is idolatry. You know that Ishtar gate has all those animals in relief on the front of it. Babylonians worshipped idols. But the false prophets that Jeremiah and God speaking through Jeremiah are concerned about are among the Jewish people who are in captivity. He refers to the prophets and diviners among you. Isn't that interesting? Okay, keep reading in the account here and see how it goes. They are trying to deceive you. They're trying to give you those messages that you want to hear, that will make you comfortable, that will get you, like for example, could there be false prophets stirring up rebellion? Certainly. But very quickly, those people are going to be executed, right? But here's the interesting one. Do not listen to the dreams. In other words, these false prophets often would say, I had a dream. Why are they doing this? God says that you encourage them to have. Back up here. The false prophets are speaking what they are doing because they're being encouraged by the Jewish people in exile. We want to hear a message that's favorable, that's positive, that's what we want to hear. And so these prophets would come and they'd say, well, I had a dream, and they would make some kind of a prediction about what would be happening. And it's not because God sent them. They're prophesying lies. God says, they're not speaking for me. I haven't sent them. But what they're doing is they're getting the pulse of the Jewish people in exile, and they're getting a sense of the discontent and the unhappiness and the frustration and the impatience. And so the result of that is these false prophets are delivering messages that are going to ultimately lead people away from God. And so the people need to continue being faithful to God regardless and not pushing. In other words, that for this time in exile, they need to wait for God. We have stories in the Bible that remind us of the fact that even some of the great people like David, Abraham, didn't wait for God to bring his plan in place. And they try to initiate some kind of event that will bring about what they think they want. They need to wait for God and for His schedule. See, what God refers to here is that He has a plan for the exiles. And it is, number one, to make, the best of a bad situation. And for us, living as exiles in the world, the more things happen in the world around us, the more we come to realize we don't belong here. We're not comfortable here. We don't enjoy many of the things that are going on in our culture and in our world. We see the violence, the immorality, the ungodliness. And we just kind of, sometimes we almost want to lash out, don't we? Well, God's advice, actually God's instruction to the exiles, is to make the best of the bad situation. Settle down, build homes, have families, do what you can where you are, work for the good of your community. But keep your faith in God. We're not looking to our world, we're not looking to the governments of the world to solve the problems that only God and the gospel of Christ can solve. And to keep God's plan in focus. Wait on Him. And so the promise is 70 years I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise. Man, that's hard. I can just see the people there. Is it time yet? Is it time yet? Where's God? Why isn't He doing it sooner? Not accepting that God has His reasons and His purposes and His plan. And so He says, if you will call, if you will seek, if you will find me, I will gather and bring you back. That's the promise of God to the good figs. There's one passage in here I just want to touch on as as we close, because it's one that is, of this section of Jeremiah, it is most frequently taken out of context because it's a promise to the exiles in Babylon, but yet we see ways that it could apply to other situations. But it speaks of hope. And he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." You may be exiles in a foreign land. You may be living with powerlessness and frustration. You may not be able to do much of anything really other than build homes and have families and plant gardens. But you can represent God in your world, whatever is going on around you. And that's a beautiful, wonderful thing to think about with that. That as we live as exiles, as we live as pilgrims, that we are walking with God. We're being an influence for Him, an influence for good. We're going to sing a song about being a pilgrim just a moment.